Good evening. We're teaching our class the Tributaries of Eden for Parshas Beshalach. So if you turn to the Chumash, to page 372, page 373, even though this Shabbos will be referred to as Shabbos Shira, where we commemorate the song that the Jewish people sang at the sea, and we all know those words in the Torah because we recite them every day, but the Psukim, the verses which actually describe the process of the sea splitting, has a lot of significance itself, which maybe because of the Shira doesn't get as often discussed. So if you see there, the verses say that Hashem said to Moshe, he says, "What are you calling out to me? Go tell the Jewish people to travel, and the sea is going to split." And there, at the top of page 372, it says, "Vayisa malach Elokim ha'olech lifnei machne Yisrael." And the angel of God, who goes before the camp of Yisrael, traveled, vayelech me'achareihem. And instead of this angel, which used to go before the camp of the Jewish people, that angel has moved now and has gone behind the Jewish people. Vayisa amud ha'anan mipnehem, and then, well, maybe it's not then, and the pillar of the cloud also moved, mipnehem, from in front of them, vayamod me'achareihem, and moved behind them. So the verse is describing the beginning of the process of the splitting of the sea, and the Torah tells us that the angel which used to go before the Jewish people now moved to the back, and the pillar of the cloud which used to go before the Jewish people now moved behind them. What angel of God are we referring to? What Malach Elokim? Where previously, anywhere in the Torah did it say that when the Jewish people were traveling out of Egypt, that there was an angel of God that went before them? So, all the commentaries immediately step in on this, starting from the beginning with the Ibn Ezra. And the Ibn Ezra takes an interesting approach, and his words are, Vayisa malach Elokim, the angel of God traveled, says the Ibn Ezra, Hu hasar hagadol haholech be'anan. This is the great minister who travels in the cloud. What great minister? How does that help us? So he says, if you take a look back earlier, chapter 13, verse 21, which is on page 366 in the Chumash, you'll see the verse says, "V'Hashem holech lifneihem yomam," that Hashem was going before the Jewish people throughout the day. So says the Ibn Ezra, Hashem going before the Jewish people is really the angel of Hashem going before the Jewish people. Previously he was referred to as V'Hashem, but now we're referring to him, this same angel that God appointed to lead the Jewish people. In this verse, he's being referred to as Malach HaElokim, which is an interesting approach to take, because generally speaking, we know that sometimes when Hashem speaks to someone, to a Navi, and it says Vayomer Hashem to that Navi or to that person, that it might be through an angel. Only Moshe received a direct communication, but many, and sometimes the Torah tells us that an angel of God came down and spoke to the people. But here, this might be the only place where you have this switch, that first the angel is just referred to as V'Hashem, and then it switches to Malach Elokim. How are we to understand that?
It still doesn't tell us which angel it was either.
It doesn't tell us which angel it was. We'll see. There is an explanation given by other commentaries.
Well, in the Haggadah it says, Ani v'lo malach, ani v'lo tzarach, whereas we say that it was an angel, that Malach HaMavet, that was killing the...
So that's a longer discussion, because we say by the sea, which is over here, this is a separate place. But in Mitzrayim, there was Hashem b'chvodo v'atzmo, as we say in the Haggadah, but there seems to be a discussion amongst the commentaries whether there was also the Malach HaMavis was in town to do something that he had to do, whether it was he was doing his regular job or he was part of the destructive force, and some give it different times. It's a very complicated discussion. But that's definitely dealt with, this issue of how do we say in the Haggadah that it was Hashem who came himself, and yet we say the Jewish people had to hide in their homes and put the blood on the door, because once the destroyer, usually referring to the angel of death, is given permission, he destroys everything. That is a very important question, and it's dealt with at length. But here, we're specifically referring to the sea, and you have this switch, according to the Ibn Ezra, from V'Hashem holech lifnehem, referring to Hashem, and then it switches here to the angel. And he says that what the verse is telling us here is as the angel moves from the front of the camp of the Jewish people to lead them, and moves to the back to protect the Jewish people, the pillar of the cloud moves along with the angel and steps between the Egyptians and the Jewish people. And that was step one in the process of the splitting of the sea. That's the approach of the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra says, however, but you should know there is another opinion. There's another opinion that says that the angel is the cloud. That when it says that the angel of God went from before the Jewish people and moved behind them, and the pillar of the cloud is an explanation of what it means, the angel of God, as if the cloud was a representation of some force, which was the angel moving. Says the Ibn Ezra, don't accept that explanation. And he says, because where do we find ever that a pillar of cloud should be referred to as an angel? And furthermore, why would the Torah divide the same thing into two and say the angel moved and then say that the pillar moved? Now, the first question isn't so difficult because the Ibn Ezra is also using a switch between V'Hashem and Malach Elokim. The Ramban, in his commentary right here, disagrees with the Ibn Ezra. I should just point out that this second explanation that the Ibn Ezra rejects as unacceptable is actually the explanation given by the Chazkuni. So there is a serious commentary on the Torah that actually gives this explanation. Anyway, moving on to the Ramban. The Ramban disagrees with the Ibn Ezra, and he says that Malach Elokim, you have to notice the switch to Elokim. And we know that Elokim always refers to the attribute of judgment. And so the Ramban says that what happened here was, as the sea is about to split, there was an arousal of the attribute of judgment of Hashem to bring destruction to the enemies. And that's what it means. Vayisa Malach Elokim, the angels of God who represent the justice, the language the Ramban uses, is the Beis Din of Hashem, stood between the Jews and the Egyptians to judge the case in order to bring punishment. And as a result of that, the pillar of the cloud moves from in front of the Jewish people, between the Jewish people, in order to begin the process of the protection of the Jewish people and the downfall of their enemies. So we have so far, and we'll see that all these different explanations are leading into a very, very deep and secret explanation that's contained within these verses. But so far, we're just trying to understand the simple words of the pasuk. What does it mean, Vayisa Malach Elokim, that the angel of God traveled from before the Jewish people to behind the Jewish people? So there's a netziv. The netziv is actually not here, but in Parshas Mishpatim. And he says, there's a verse that says, V'Hashem holech lifnehem, that Hashem was going before the Jewish people. And yet here it says, Vayisa Malach Elokim, that there was an angel going before the Jewish people. So instead of like the Ibn Ezra learns that these are the same entity, the Netziv asks it as a contradiction. Was it Hashem leading the Jewish people? Or was there an angel of Hashem leading the Jewish people? And the Netziv, I'm not going to read his words inside in the Hebrew, I'm just going to translate. Listen to this, an amazing concept that we can apply to many areas of the Torah. You should know that the sovereignty of heaven follows the systems of the sovereignty in this world. The king protects his people. The king cares for his people. But he can't do so himself. The king appoints ministers who do so in the name of the king. However, there are times that the king himself needs to go out and do whatever he needs to do, either to fight a war or to provide for certain needs of the people, where the king has to do so himself. But a king never travels alone. Rather, he has on his right Sar Ram Umisnase Ala Mamunim, the foremost minister, the prime minister, the viceroy, if we may. The king always travels with one person who is the closest to him. The king does not speak to commoners. The king does not speak to peasants, even when he needs to. Rather, the king has this minister who is very high up, and the king will whisper in the ears of this minister. The minister will speak the words, and the people will respond. And then once again, the king doesn't have that direct communication. So not because Hashem needs to do so, but because the system of the sovereignty of heaven is set up in a way to emulate the system of the world below. Now, nobody will ever suggest that when the peasant is hearing these words, that he would ever confuse and think that he's hearing the words of the minister. He sees the king whispering into the ears of the minister, and he sees the minister speaking as if he's repeating the words of the king. To the peasant, to the commoner who's in communication with the king, this is how he communicates with the king. To him, he is speaking directly to the king. And you should know, therefore, that even though there's a serious punishment for someone who rebels against a general, a minister of the king, if the king sends out some soldiers and tells them to go and arrange for something, and people rebel or commit treason through the words of these soldiers, that's a serious punishment. But if you if you do something wrong towards this minister as he's speaking before the king, that's not just insulting the minister of the king, but that's insulting the king himself. So he says, in the same way, HaKadosh Baruch Hu could do everything himself. Hashem doesn't need ministers. Nevertheless, because so it occurred to Hashem's will that he should have the system of ministers. Ki malachav yitzav elach lishmarcha b'chol derachacha. Hashem sends on the angels. So therefore, as much as Hashem himself was holech lifnehem, but all the process and the actions happens through the Malach Ram V'Nisa, the great ministering angel, which, according to Rabbi Yochanan, would be the angel Michael, and according to Rabbi Chanina, it would be the angel Gavriel. Now it's interesting because we have this disagreement. We've discussed this in previous classes. The angel Michael is generally associated, he's called the Sar HaMayim, the minister of water. He's the angel associated with Chesed. And Gavriel is the Sar HaEsh, the angel of fire. He's usually associated with Gevurah, judgment, and severity. So, nevertheless, it's one of these two angels who it's referring to. So says the Netziv, they're both true. V'Hashem holech lifneim, it's Hashem walking before them. But in terms of the pragmatic actions that are done for the actual movement of the clouds, that's all done through the Sar, Ram, V'Nisa, this exalted minister, which is either Michael or Gabriel. I'd like to just hold on to these thoughts, and hopefully we'll come back to try to explain how is it that we have these angels who are moving, which angel is it. I'd like to come back, but I'd like to deviate for a little bit into a completely different area. There was a great Hasidic Rebbe called Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Rimanov. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Rimanov gave lectures. His shiurim, his drashas, were all about the parsha of the man. He darshaned on the parsha of the man for 22 years straight. And we have some of these drashas, some of these teachings in some of the Sfarim. We certainly don't have 22 years worth. But it's told that he felt that the channel of Parnasa, of sustenance, of livelihood, that was coming down to the Jewish people in his generation was being passed through him. As we know, the righteous, they become channels to bring down based on their midos and who they are. As we've discussed, Avram Avinu becomes the channel for chesed, Yitzchak becomes the channel for gevura, Yaakov becomes the channel for tiferes, for harmony, for balance between chesed and din. And in the same way, each individual aspect, so Menachem Mendel of Romanov, he was the channel through which Parnasa was coming down, and therefore, because he saw this as his purpose or task in the world, he expounded every Shabbos all the time on the parsha of the Man. He found a way to relate every single parsha to the Man. And again, we have very little of this. But he has a teaching which he talks about this verse, Vayisa Malach Elokim, that the angel of God traveled. And this teaching, I have to prepare you for this, this teaching of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Romanov is very, very deep and esoteric. So please follow me. Let's descend into the sea and hopefully come out on the other side of this teaching. He says, inside of you, there are forces that are driving you to do good. These are spiritual forces that were given to you by Hashem, that empower you to desire to do the right thing all the time. He says, that's your Malach Elokim. That's your angel of God. But sometimes you have forces in the world at large that their desire is to slow us from our service of Hashem, and they present challenges to us. And as we've discussed many times, there are two kinds of challenges, internal challenges and external challenges. Whatever they are, that's Machne Mitzrayim, the camp of the Egyptians, which is there to attack you and to destroy you. They've got you up against the sea, meaning you've got nowhere to go, and they are just attacking you from every end, from every perspective, to try to get you to sin. Specifically, the challenge represented by the Egyptians is the challenge in faith. Because everything depends on your faith. If you believe that Hashem is there and that Hashem is watching you and that Hashem is taking care of you, and you understand that everything that you have is from Hashem, through faith, a person is able to overcome every inclination. The struggles, the challenges to fulfill Torah and mitzvahs comes from these internal questions, as we find in the parasha. Is Hashem really amongst us? Is Hashem taking care of us? Where is Hashem? Is Hashem really watching? These questions in Amunah. And of course, you can see the Jewish people standing at the sea who are saying, how are we going to survive? We're stuck in this difficult place. Let's go back to Egypt, is really us, inside of each of us, saying, I can't handle this. This is too difficult. Why can't I just give in to my inclinations? So Hashem helps you. The cloud which moves from before you, Hashem moves that behind you. Hashem allows us the opportunity to separate and to realize that the attack that the Egyptians are bringing upon us is not real. It isn't there. And he says, if you look back at the story of the Jews and the Egyptians, once you have the cloud and the Jewish people have light, and the Egyptians are lost there in darkness, you have a very interesting phenomenon. You have, basically, in essence, a one-way mirror, where you can, as opposed to, you've got a two-way mirror, where you've got that one person can see through and the other person can't see the other way. And you have this in a room where you're sitting in the dark and someone is outside with a light, you can see. So he says, in the story of Egypt, it was the Egyptians who could see the Jewish people, but the Jewish people couldn't see the Egyptians. That's why the Egyptians followed them, because they couldn't necessarily see everything around, but they did see the Jewish people moving and they followed them. Back to the metaphor. He says, the Egyptians followed the Jewish people representing the evil forces that are trying to destroy you, but you, the Jewish people, representing you, have found a way to escape into the arms of Hashem, into a place of safety. And the evil tries to follow you and is destroyed. And when we, the Jewish people, see the destruction of our enemy, it brings back our faith. And through that faith, we can once again reconnect to Hashem and perform the Torah and mitzvahs. And that was the easy part. And here's where he goes really deep. We say in the Shema, V'haya im shama tishmu al mitzvosai, it will be that when you will listen to my commandments and you will do everything and you will serve God with all your heart and all your soul. How would we have expected that verse to end? It should say, you will merit the world to come. You will merit a portion in Gan Eden above anyone else because you've performed all the mitzvahs. Instead, we say this in the Shema every day. If you perform all the mitzvahs, Hashem says, V'nasati metar artzachem be'ito, I will send you the rain in the right time. Aren't we supposed to serve Hashem for more spiritual purposes than the rain? And where is this promise of Olam Haba, the world to come? This is the place where the Torah tells us, if you do the mitzvahs, this is what's going to happen. This is a question discussed by many of the books. Menachem Mendel of Rimanov says, we kind of misunderstand the meaning of that verse. The verse says in Eicha, Mipi Elyon lo seitzei haros, from Hashem, nothing bad ever comes. Let me say that again, because none of us have really succeeded, and this becomes our life goal. We have to try to understand this. Nothing bad ever comes from Hashem. We are just really not good at recognizing that and seeing how everything is good. We can intellectually argue and say that everything is for the good. Nachum Ish Gamzu was able to say Gamzu Latova. Rabbi Akiva was able to say Kol Mal David, Rachman Latav Avid, whatever Hashem does is for the good. They were able to see, and these are people who seriously suffered. Nachum Ish Gamzu, by the end of his life, was laying in his bed without his hands or feet, which had to be removed, amputated. Rabbi Akiva, of course, was killed in most torturous fashion. And they somehow were able to overcome the challenges of this world and see that everything is for the good. He says, Hashem showers everyone with just positive influence. But based on your behavior, is what's best for you comes down in this world in a different way. So based on whatever happens to you is for the good. But based on who you are and what situation you are and what you're ready for and what you've done with your life and all the other millions of factors that decide what should happen to you at any moment, that's the shape or format that good takes. But it's all good. He says, that's why the Torah uses for this a metaphor of the rain. Because the rain falls down for everyone equally. But if you've just got your hair done, or you're wearing a new hat, or you're stuck outside, or you're traveling, or you really need to hurry somewhere, the rain is harmful, but that's the same rain which is Gishmei Bracha, which brings blessings, and which satiates you, the food that you need, which you wouldn't have if there wouldn't be rain. Rain is good. Based on the fact that you put yourself outside without the proper clothing, that rain is now a hindrance for you or a difficulty. Or if you are in a place that doesn't have proper drainage, you've built houses in places where naturally maybe it wasn't the best idea, then the rain can be a destructive force. Sometimes that rain just continues to rain and rain and rain, and so much rain until it destroys. The rain itself is good. It's we, as we receive it, because of the kinds of vessels that we are, that it comes down differently. He says that's what the Torah tells you. If you will hear me, if you will follow the commandments, you will know that the rain, meaning the spiritual influence which comes down from above, will be the spiritual influence which is the rain in the right time. It will come down in a way which is comfortable for you. It will come down in a way that you can handle it. It's not just referring to the physical rain, but it's referring to all the spiritual influence, which eventually, through all that comes down to you, whether it be the good which you receive, or chas v'shalom, any punishment or difficulties or tsaras that you receive, all of that will be ultimately be for the good. It's all the rain in order to make things grow. He says, for the great tzaddikim, they only see the good. And the next thing he says is so deep that I don't know if I really understand it, but let me say it to you anyway. He says, the Jewish people, when they were standing at the sea, they had difficulty with their amunah, with their faith. And Hashem showed them the salvation that was coming. It gave them, when they were at the sea, as we're told, that even the maidservant at the sea saw more than Yechezkel the prophet would see. And Yechezkel describes to us the chariot of God, whatever that means in some esoteric term. Every single lowly individual, even the maidservant, who had never received any education, who had no knowledge, she was on such a high level of prophecy. He says it was so clear to the Jewish people that everything that had ever happened to them was for the good, that the boundaries between dry land and sea ceased to exist. The splitting of the sea, as much as it happened in the physical world, happened more in the minds of the Jewish people. And as in their minds, those lines between what is dry land and what is water disappeared because everything was for the good, and every piece of land, every path was a road that they can travel on because Hashem is going to arrange for the good for you, regardless of how it seems to you. In that state of prophecy, there was no obstacle called the sea, and says Menachem Mendel of Rimanov, and I quote, they walked directly over the water. The sea turned to land in their minds, and that's what really defines reality. So someone else might have been there and seen water, but the Jewish people walked on water. That's what he says. And so the Egyptians said, there's a road straight into the sea. Because they saw a sea. They didn't even fathom. They saw bad things happening to them as bad things. And so they saw the sea and they walked into the sea. What a powerful teaching from Menachem Mendel of Rimanov. That things are good because you see them as good, and when you see them as good, they become so good that they become that path which you can travel on. So he says, Vayisa Malach Elokim, the angel of God, represents the forces inside you, that Hashem gave you the power to see the good, to see how everything that comes from Hashem is for the good. That travels before the Jewish people, and that gives the Jewish people the ability to achieve this perspective that everything that has ever happened to them, all of Galus Mitzrayim, was Kol Ma Da'avid Rachmanu L'Tavavid, everything that Hashem does is for the good. And they walked right over the water. And he says, and I quote, he says, please don't misunderstand. The sea actually did split. But exactly how that works with what I just told you, I am not permitted to explain because somebody's going to misunderstand. End quote. And so in his writing, he says, the sea split. But what I'm telling you that the Jewish people saw that, or understood that everything is from Hashem and everything's for the good, they walked over the water, doesn't contradict the sea splitting, but if I explain it, someone's going to misunderstand. So please just trust me on this and let's move on. End quote. So we're going to trust them on this and just move on. He says the Egyptians saw that they were traveling into the sea. You think maybe the first guy thinks he can walk on water. But after a while, everyone's going down, they're not following. Why are they following? So he says, because the story of Egypt happens more in the minds of the people involved than outside. Of course, there's a physical occurrence of what happens. But he says the Egyptians were people who followed the Gashmias, they followed their Chumrias, they were people who were so into the physical world and the physical indulgences that he says when it comes to the sea, their physicality, their horses drag them into the sea. Because when you live a life where you allow your physicality, your indulgences, all your desires to lead you, that is really you following your horse, being dragged by your horse into the sea. So while the Jewish people were ascending to Hashem, and therefore were crossing the sea, the Egyptians, because in their minds they were so lost in their money and their wealth and in all their desires, therefore as a result of that, the horses dragged them down into the sea.
You say that in Israel we're at the 49th level of Tumah when they left Mitzrayim. It's hard to imagine that they rose to such a high spiritual level that they could just essentially walk on water or believe strongly enough that the physical wasn't...
Well, I think your question really is on the Medrash that says that the maidservant at the sea saw more than Yechezkel would see. And we know to become a prophet like Yechezkel took a lifetime of work. And here, the maidservant who had never been initiated in any way, all of a sudden she's having... And so I'll tell you some sort of answer, but it's not an adequate, it doesn't really fully answer the question. But we're told that the revelation of Hashem, when Hashem did appear, B'chod of Atzma himself, in Egypt, he revealed himself to the Jewish people. And that night, they moved from negative 49 to positive 49. And then by the time the night was over, all that was taken back and they returned to zero. That's the way that we... And so the Jewish people are going to spend the next 49 days going from 0 to 49, then to 50 to receive the Torah. But that night they did go in a matter of a moment. When Hashem appeared in Egypt, they went from negative 49 to 0. At that point, so they weren't in negative when they were experiencing this. But to further answer your question, this was a special revelation that Hashem gave to the Jewish people. And the proof is, as soon as they got out of the sea, they're already complaining. It was a momentary gift, much like the revelation that they experienced that night, which took them from negative 49 to positive 49. Then it was taken away from them, and they were left in the middle. So too, whatever power of the prophecy which they received at this time, anyone can be overwhelmed in the moment. When we talk about requiring hard work to get anywhere, that's to have anything that's going to stay and maintain itself and be meaningful in a long-term way. So, says Menachem Mendel Rimanov, it says that Moshe had to push the Jewish people to leave the sea, as it says, Moshe had to, so usually we read it as a negative thing. Moshe was trying to push the people to go. He says no. The Jewish people were in the sea and they were experiencing such an overwhelming spiritual awareness. They were experiencing such a high level of prophecy that they refused to leave. And Moshe had to literally drag them out of the sea. And he says that we have to understand that when we talk about the man, we're referring to the parnasa that we receive today. Everything that we get from Hashem is a spiritual influence. It's through the light that Hashem bestows upon us whatever we need. And sometimes we don't understand how that thing could be good. And sometimes it's not the kind of thing we're ever meant to understand. Sometimes it's the kind of thing where we can't even contemplate it. But somehow we have to understand that there is a system. And within that system, which if we would know it, things would make sense. And then we would go, oh, that's That makes sense. But without that knowledge, we're sort of left in the dark. But what we need is the amunah, says Menachem Mendel of Rimanov, that spiritual influence. That's why the Torah uses, when it talks about the man, it says, Hineni mamtir lachem, lechem min hashamayim. I am going to rain down man from heaven. It uses the term mamtir to tell you that this, very much like the rain, all the spiritual influence, and that's why we say that mizonos of shaladam, for a person to be sustained, is as difficult as the splitting of the sea, because in order for you to get parnasa, you have to begin to understand that everything that Hashem gives you is for the good, and if you do v'hayam shemar tishma, if you follow the mitzvahs, and then v'nasati mitar artzachem be'ito, then the rain comes down in a way where we don't have to say, well, how is this good? But we can clearly understand the good that's in it. Which is a beautiful explanation, because what this means is that the Malach Elokim, which is traveling in this verse, according to Menachem of Rimanov, as much as there's a splitting of the sea going on in the world outside, the most important place where it's happening is within the minds of the Jewish people. And the Malach Elokim is the forces inside you. You are sort of like the angel of God performing the service of Hashem because of the forces that Hashem put into you, trying to move you towards doing good. And now let's take this a little bit deeper. On page 372, there's three verses, verse 19, verse 20, and verse 21, Yutes Chaf Chaf Aleph. And in these verses, we've discussed this before, each of these verses has exactly 72 letters. It's been counted many times. It's there. There's 72 letters. Now, what the
it's on page 372.
Oh, very good. Page 3. So, if you, what the chances? Maybe someone can do this mathematical calculation, and it's probably pretty high. What are the chances that three random verses in the Torah, three random consecutive verses in the Torah, should have each 72 letters exactly?
And end up on page 3.
Well, that's in this Chumash. So we're told that this is actually not a coincidence. There is a name of God. There is a name of Hashem. This name of Hashem is a 72-word name. It's not a 72-letter name, it's a 72-word name. It's actually 216 letters, 3 times 72. And you can see it in these verses. The way that you can find this name is if you take letter 1 from verse 1, followed by letter 72 from verse 2, followed by letter 1 of verse 3, you'll have a Vav, a Hey, and a Vav. That's triplet number 1. Then you take the second letter of verse 1, the Yud, followed by the second to last letter of verse 2, which is the Lamed, followed by the second letter of verse 3, which is the Yud, and you have triplet number 2. Until you come, and so forth and so on, until you come to the final triplet, which is the Mem of verse 1, the Vav, the first letter in verse 2, and then the Mem in verse 3, the final letter. So it's the final letter of the first verse, the first letter of the second verse, and the final letter of the third verse, and you get your 72nd triplet. These 72 triplets form a very, very long name of Hashem. This name was what split the sea. This name is, as we've discussed many times, Hashem doesn't have names. Hashem is infinite. The reason why we use names for Hashem, they represent the attributes of Hashem. The attribute associated with the splitting of the sea is connected to this name, the 72 triplet, 216 letter name of Hashem. I want you to hear this because this is so, so deep. The word chesed, ches samach daled, is 72. The word gevura, gimel beis vav reish hey, is 216. There are 216 letters, 72 triplets. This name is the ultimate combination of chesed and gevura, of kindness and severity, because we have a problem with the splitting of the sea. This is going to be a miracle that is going to be destructive. Thousands of soldiers of the Egyptians are going to die in a tumultuous storm within the ocean, within the sea. Meanwhile, for the Jewish people, it's going to be Az Yashir. There will be water coming from out of the walls. There will be a canopy. There will be light from Hashem. They will be singing the ultimate song. Is such a contradiction here between the power and force of the judgment and the beauty and peace of the salvation, that the two should have trouble working together. It's only through Hashem brought down the 72 triplet, 72 word, 216 letter name, which is the ultimate combination of chesed and gevura. And that's why it's Vashem holech lifneim, Hashem Yud Kei Vav Kei, name of chesed, who's going before, or rachamim, which is going before them. But the malach elokim, the judgment, the courts of Hashem, are going behind them to punish the Egyptians. And much like we say that in every plague, there was a punishment for the Egyptians and a healing for the Jews. Here, as the Jews were walking past the sea, we're told that the angels came complaining to God and said, these worshipped idols, those worshipped idols, why should the Jewish people be saved? The sea itself said to Moshe, why should I split for you? I have my job to do. Why should I give up my job because you have to do your job? There was a lot of prosecution against the miracle of the splitting of the sea. But the name of the 72 triplet, 216 letter, the 72 word name of Hashem, was the force which completely obliterated the Egyptians and completely saved the Jewish people. This name allows for this balance of chesed and gevura. Through Tiferes, through the harmony and the balance. Hashem wanted to create the world with judgment, and then He added to it the attribute of mercy. And together we have this balance that exists in the world. And that's why the first verse has all the letters in order, because the first verse is chesed. The second verse, all the letters are backwards, because that backwards is gevura. And then the third, which is this balance of bringing them all together, that again goes back to being in order. So you understand that it's incredible that the 72 word name of Hashem, which has its own meaning, each of the triplets has a concept and a meaning to it, which is associated with different areas and different attributes, and yet these 216 letters, if you shuffle them so that it's 172, 1, 270, 1, 2, 3, 73, and so forth, you get 3 verses that describe the splitting of the sea. These verses that describe the splitting of the sea are naturally going to be a form that can be found in that name, because that's what that name does. I know it's pretty deep, but just work with me here. That's why the Chazkuni writes that you invoke this name. Now, you never recite the 72 word name of Hashem. But what you do is there's one time of the year, or a season within the year, when you recite name number 1 and name number 37 of these triplets. And that is, as you're walking around the bima with your lulav and esrog on Sukkot, you say the statement, Ani vahu hoshiana, or as some versions of the Siddur have it, Ani vaho hoshiana. Ani, Aleph Nun Yud, happens to be triplet number 37. And Vav He Vav, Vahu, or Vaho, is triplet number 1. Says the Chizkuni, because on Sukkot, what are we praying for? For the rain, for the mayim, for the parnasa, for the rain, which, as we said, can look like chesed, can look like gevura, can look like judgment. But we want that it should be only a punishment for our enemies, but it should be a protection for us. So that's why on Sukkot we say Ani Vaho, as if we can't say the whole name, but I'll say triplet number 1 and triplet number 37. So as if I'm dividing into two parts, and I'm saying number 1, which is the first 36, and then number 37, which is the first of the next 36, as if I'm trying to say them all.
If you wanted to see what all these triplets were, is there anything against writing it out, figuring it out?
Well, there are holy books that have it. In fact, if you go into many shuls, they'll have like a chart with like a Shavisi Hashem L'Negdi Summit, and they have all these names, and many of them actually have spelled out this full name. And you can see there are 72 triplets, and some of them actually form common words, and there's deep significance to them. I wouldn't write it on any paper that you're going to have to then keep as shemus. But you can find this in Svarim and in places. So, how's this for new meaning to a verse? Says Rabbeinu Bachye, the Jewish people, when they experienced the miracle at the sea, they said, Zeh Keli va'anveu. This is my God, and I will beautify him. All of a sudden, the Jewish people are at the sea, and they say, you know what? This was such a great miracle. Every mitzvah that I do, I'm going to make it as beautiful as I can. I have a shofar, I'm going to make it a beautiful shofar. I'm going to buy light Hanukkah candles. I'm going to get a beautiful menorah, a beautiful talus with a beautiful atara, with a beautiful tefillin, with a beautiful challah cover, and a beautiful Shabbos candles. Everything I'm going to make beautiful. Why? What's the source for making mitzvahs beautiful? Zeh Keli, this is my God, va'anveu, and I will beautify him. Where does this come in the middle of the sea? What was the inspiration to all of a sudden want to beautify the mitzvahs? Says Rabbeinu Bachye, va'anvehu is ani vahu. The Jewish people recognized what just happened. The same exact miracle that saved them, destroyed the Egyptians. Is this a miracle of mercy or is it a miracle of judgment? Are things good or are things bad? It's all from Hashem. And things happen the way they're supposed to happen. And they said, Ani vahu. And Rabbeinu Bachye explains, Ani vahu means Adam elo. I and Hashem are one. Hashem is together with us. And that's why we have a mitzvah, v'halachta b'drachav, that we're supposed to walk in the ways of Hashem. Because we're supposed to recognize that Hashem is teaching us how we are supposed to be, and by studying the Torah and the mitzvahs, we come to understand what Hashem is supposed to be. As you said many times in this class, that people have to understand when you go to visit someone who's sick, chas v'shalom, lo aleinu. So people go to visit because you want to do this person a favor. You should also, before you go in, you should say to yourself, I'm about to perform a mitzvah. Avahalachta b'derachav. Hashem visited the sick in order to teach us that it's a good thing to visit the sick, and I want to go in the ways of Hashem. And that way you turn your action of chesed, which it is, into another mitzvah, avahalachta b'derachav, of going in the ways of Hashem. And the reason was because ani vahu. Hashem says to Yaakov as we're going down to Egypt, Anochi ered imcha Mitzrayim, I will go down with you to Egypt. Says Rabbeinu Bachye, when the verse states, Vayisa malach Elokim, he says, because that verse is telling you, it's not just Vayisu Yisrael Mitzrayim, that the Jewish people left Egypt. That same term, Vayisu Yisrael, that the Jewish people left, is Vayisa malach Elokim, Hashem is also traveling. This verse, the first verse, the beginning of this name of Hashem, of Ani vahu, of Hashem being with us, is Hashem saying, I was in Egypt too. I was in the burning bush. Imo anochi batzara, whatever trouble we're experiencing, kaviyachol, as if we can understand what any of these words mean, but Hashem, so to speak, is also in exile. And when we come out of the exile, Hashem comes out with us, Ani vahu. When they said, Zeh Keli va'anveu, means we're going to emulate the ways of Hashem. And whatever comes with that, we're going to try to do this in such a way that we perform all the mitzvahs, not just the way that we were commanded to do it, but in the way that Hashem does it, where He didn't just split the sea for them, which they would have been more than happy. Ilu karlanu esayam, v'lo aviranu b'sochel becharava dayenu. We say that in the Haggadah. We say, we were so desperate. Any path. If Hashem would have just given us the strength to swim, we would have taken that. But instead, He brought dry land. And then we say, well, even if Hashem gave us dry land, Hashem that wouldn't have drowned our enemies within it, each step was a further al-achas kam v'kam. We say, look how much Hashem does for us. And so when we see this, how much Hashem did for us at the sea, we're overwhelmed with this desire to perform mitzvos, to be v'haya im shemar tishmu al mitzvosai. And that's what leads to the Jewish people to say, Zeh keli v'anveyu, this is my God, and I won't just perform the mitzvahs, but I will seek to perform the mitzvahs in the way that Hashem split the sea for us. Bringing us all the way back to the beginning. We had this trouble understanding what's the Malach Elokim, what's the angel of God that's traveling. And so we have these different opinions. We have this opinion that it's this pillar of the cloud. We have this one explanation that it's the minister of Hashem. We have this other explanation that it's the basin of Hashem. It could be that all the explanations are all true. Because what's happening here is Hashem is invoking is the 72-word name, this balance of Chesed and Gevura, and it should be incredible to you that Gevura is exactly 3 times the word Chesed. Right? 72 times 3 is 216. Because these names are representations of what they really are when you bring it all together. This 72-word name is the bringing together of all the aspects and saying there is no contradiction between Hashem's chesed and Hashem's gevura. There is no judgment in terms of good things happening, of reward and punishment. And I don't mean there's no reward and punishment. Of course there's reward and punishment. But the reward and punishment is all good because it's meant to bring you to the good. So when someone is punished, even though it's painful, it's an experience, it isn't bad. Punishment isn't bad. However, we are perfectly permitted not to commit any transgressions, so that we should not be liable to any punishment, so that we can see v'nasati mitar artzachem be'ito, that the shefa, the spiritual influence which comes down upon us. And so, of course, you understand why the Netziv quotes these 2 opinions. One who says that this angel that was on the right of Hashem was the angel Michael. And the other one says, no, it wasn't the angel Michael, it was the angel Gabriel. Which one was it? Well, the answer is it depends which perspective you're looking at. Whoever it was the angel. It was either the angel of Chesed, the angel of Mayim, or the angel of Gevura, the angel of fire. It was either the saving of the Jewish people, it was the destruction of the Egyptians, but it's all one. There's no questions. There are no contradictions, but only from the perspective we choose to see, from the blindness that the Egyptians are looking at, from the darkness of what they see, because they're in the dark room and they see the light outside, they only have one perspective. But the one who's standing in the light can't see the darkness. Because the one who's standing in the light isn't fooled by the darkness. When the Jewish people received this vision at the sea, it was so clear to them that everything that had ever happened to them was for the good. That's the miracle of the splitting of the sea. The splitting of the sea is the splitting, as Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Ribbentrop so beautifully explained, the splitting of the sea happens in the minds of the Jewish people. It's the division between Tov and Ra, the confusion of good and evil. And as we said, everything in the Torah goes back to the Garden of Eden. And what happened in the Garden of Eden was not that evil was introduced to the world. There was evil. How do we know there was evil? Because they sinned. How do we know there was evil? Because there was the serpent who came to seduce them. But there was no evil inside them. There was no confusion of good and evil. The Jewish people stepped into the sea. They gained this perspective of Hashem, which split the sea. It put a pillar, a cloud, between them and the Egyptians. And they saw and they understood for a moment. They saw perspective. And when that moment of perspective, everything made perfect sense. And when it made perfect sense, at that point, there was no longer land and sea. But it was just the path of Hashem. And if Hashem says travel, we can travel through it. May we merit that in the schus of our emunah, that we should merit the Venasati mitar artzchem be'ita, the spiritual influence which comes down upon us, the bread, the manna which Hashem bestows upon us, should be of that which we don't find difficult to differentiate, to understand how it's for the good. And may we merit that Hashem should bring us shefa, bracha, and atzlacha, and we should all merit olam haba, and the Jewish people should return to Tzion b'meher b'yameinu through all the miracles, in the same way that Hashem performed miracles for the Jewish people as they left Egypt.
Amen.
Amen.